Welcome to History Arms, where the battles forgotten by time are brought back to life. This was a war that should never have happened. One side brought steel and fire, 1 million Red Army soldiers, thousands of tanks. The other, just 30,000 hunters, a few rifles, and endless snow. Stalin expected to win in a week, but that lightning war became a white nightmare, one the Red Army would never forget, because their enemy wasn't an army. It was the forest. It was winter. They weren't defeated by bullets. They disappeared. This is the Winter War. No one expected Finland to last a week, a nation of just 4 million. Facing the Red Army, the largest military machine in the world. The Soviets brought tanks, planes, and nearly 500,000 men. The Finns had hunting rifles, outdated artillery, and snow, lots of snow. This was supposed to be a simple operation, a short, glorious campaign. Moscow even installed a puppet government before the first shot was fired. But something happened in those forests. The snow didn't melt under Soviet boots. It swallowed them. And from that white silence came a war that no one, especially Stalin, wanted to remember. And this was just the beginning of men on skis, of rifles wrapped in burlap, of a nation that should have fallen, but didn't. Stalin didn't want a war. He wanted security, a buffer, a few dozen kilometers to push the border back from Leningrad. But when negotiations failed, he didn't hesitate. On November 30th, 1939, the Red Army rolled across the border. This was supposed to be simple, a political formality backed by force. The Soviets had already prepared a new government in exile, the so-called Finnish Democratic Republic, led by a Finnish communist who hadn't lived in Finland for years. Stalin expected the Finns to fold. How could they resist? The Soviet Union had 5 times the population, 100 times the tanks, and an air force that dwarfed Finland's like a blizzard over a candle. To the Soviet High Command, this wasn't a real war. It was a punishment, a lesson in obedience, a quick winter campaign followed by a treaty on Soviet terms. Propaganda posters showed cheerful Red Army soldiers marching into Finnish towns, smiling children throwing flowers, grateful workers embracing liberation. There were no flowers, and no one smiled, because Stalin's plan had one fatal flaw. He thought Finland would break, but Finland didn't break. It vanished into the forests, into the snow, into silence. The world looked at Finland and saw a doomed nation, but Finland didn't scream, it didn't shout, it simply got ready. As Soviet tanks massed on the border, Finnish engineers laid mines beneath frozen lakes. Civilians dug trenches by hand, through ice, through stone, through permafrost. Villagers melted church bells to make shells. Forests were thinned to create kill zones. Entire towns were evacuated and wired for demolition. If the Soviets took Finland, they would inherit ashes. Finland had no illusions. They knew what was coming. There would be no foreign help, no lend-lease, no parachuted supplies, no reinforcements. The West watched, then looked away. So the Finns turned inward. They built with wood and iron. They trained with what they had. No one asked for heroism, only for silence, discipline, and a rifle that didn't jam in the cold. Some soldiers wore civilian coats. Some carried rifles from the last war. Some had never fired a bullet. But they knew the forests. They knew the cold. and they knew one simple truth. If they stood and fought like a normal army, they would be destroyed. But if they vanished into the trees, they might survive. The Red Army crossed the border with songs, banners, and orders to occupy Helsinki in 2 weeks. Then the snow began to fall. Tanks meant for the streets of Warsaw bogged down in pine forests. Trucks stalled. Engines froze. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and marched into the woods. Woods they could neither read nor command. Maps were useless. Compass needles spun. Officers gave orders no one could hear, because the snow absorbed everything. White, silent, endless. And in that silence, things began to go missing. Scouting parties disappeared, supply columns vanished, entire battalions marched into the trees and never came out. The Red Army was not trained for this. Many soldiers had never seen snow like this. They wore dark coats that stood out against the white. They fired weapons that jammed in the cold. And they moved in columns, perfect for ambush. Because the Finns were watching and waiting. From behind the trees, from frozen ditches, from the hills and lakes and fog and night, the Finns began to strike. They moved on skis. They traveled faster than trucks. They fought in small groups, hit hard, and disappeared again. The Red Army didn't understand it. And worse, they couldn't stop it. They had entered Finland. But it was the Finns who owned the snow. The Red Army had the numbers, but the Finns had the snow. And in that snow, the Soviets kept dying. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every frozen path could lead to a mine. Every silent glade could erupt in fire. Finnish soldiers hit hard and vanished. They cut supply lines, burned fuel depots, ambushed convoys, and struck at night, then melted into the woods. The Soviets never knew where the next attack would come from. And even when there was no attack, they saw ghosts in the snow. Morale crumbled. Units broke apart. Officers screamed orders into the wind. Some commanders were killed by their own men. Others vanished in the night. The Red Army had been told they would be liberators, welcomed by grateful workers. Instead, they marched into a white graveyard, and the Finns were just getting started. They moved with precision, dressed in white, silent, and swift. Sometimes with skis, sometimes with sled dogs, always faster than the Soviets could react. And then came the snipers. From the trees, from the rocks, from snowbanks you didn't know were there. A single shot, then nothing. Simo Heiha, small, quiet, a farmer turned marksman. He killed hundreds, without a scope, without a word, and he was not alone. He never spoke much. He didn't need to. Simo Heiha was the ghost in the woods. A quiet farmer turned into the most lethal sniper in history. He used no scope, too much glare from the sun. He relied on his iron sights and instincts sharpened by years of hunting elk in the frozen north. He wore a mask, white, not to hide from the enemy, but to stop his breath from fogging in the air. He would wait for hours, sometimes days, buried in snow, motionless, barely breathing. Then, one shot, one kill, gone again. The Soviets gave him a name, Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Whole regiments feared a single man. Soviet snipers were deployed to hunt him. Artillery barrages were launched just to kill him. They failed. He moved too well. He hid too deeply. He thought too simply. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't even fighting for revenge. He was fighting for Finland, for the trees, for the snow, for the silence. And in that silence, he became legend. The world watched, but did not act. As Finnish soldiers froze in their trenches, as civilians braved the bombs, and as snipers like Simo Heiha haunted the woods, the great powers waited. Britain and France condemned the Soviet invasion, but offered little more than words. They debated sending aid, even troops. But nothing came. Sweden shared weapons and volunteers, but not soldiers, not officially. Germany, bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, remained silent, pretending neutrality, but watching closely. And the League of Nations? They expelled the Soviet Union. But by then, the forests were already red with blood. Why didn't the world intervene? Some feared war with Stalin. Others saw the war as distant, irrelevant. Some even believed Finland wouldn't last a week. But week after week, month after month, the Finns endured. They bled, they froze, they fought. And as the world remained still, one truth became clear. Finland stood alone and refused to fall. The Winter War ended in March 1940. Finland was forced to surrender territory, but not its soul. The Soviets paid dearly, over 100,000 casualties for land that gave them no peace and a reputation stained in the eyes of the world. And Finland, it stood, bruised, bloody, but still standing. The forests were quiet again. The snow, once red, turned white once more. But for those who survived, and for those who remembered, the silence would never be the same. The Winter War was not about victory. It was about dignity. It was about defiance. A tiny nation lost in the cold, telling the world, we will not be erased. Not by steel, not by snow, not by silence.